Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Sander van der Linden, who is professor of social psychology at Cambridge University, also the author of a couple books. This one right here called Foolproof: Why Misinformation Infects Our Minds and How to Build Immunity. And then also this one co-authored The Psychology of Misinformation. Welcome, Sander.
Thanks so much for having me on.
So look, I think what you're trying to do in your work is something which has a long history, right? Goes all the way back to Aristotle, right?
Mm,
How do you
yeah,
make sure that people believe things that are true, but also it's not just about the veracity of their beliefs, but also, I mean, that might be the end goal, but also there's something about the method, right? And the process by which people come to believe, right? To immunize them from methods of persuasion which are illegitimate in some way. And so you've come up with this notion of pre-bunking, which is
yes.
which super. I mean, I've talked to a lot of people about this notion of pre-bunking, and you're really the one that has popularized this idea, and it draws analogously from virology, right? The idea that you could potentially immunize people against these false beliefs and these inappropriate methods of persuasion by exposing them to a kind of a weakened dose, right? Um,
Exactly.
and so I want to dig into that, but maybe we should just start with this whole idea of misinformation, which is I think
Mm.
the that's the virus that we're trying to prevent people from getting infected by. Um, what exactly is misinformation? How does it differ from just falsities? And to what extent is this a new problem as opposed to something that, again, going back to Aristotle, we've had to worry about?
Mm. Yeah, so I chaired a consensus report for the American Psychological Association. So we tried to come up with a consensus definition that everyone could agree on. And I think what we settled on is that misinformation is about more than just obvious falsehoods. It's also about misleading information. So information in a way that's designed either unintentionally or intentionally to dupe people because it uses some kind of manipulation technique, right? Whether that's presenting opinion as fact, presenting things out of context. You mentioned Aristotle a few times. There's snake oil salesman techniques that go back thousands of years that politicians still use today. And so the idea really is that, we want to be inclusive of the concept, and that it includes both things that are obviously false, right? The earth isn't flat, climate change is real, and so on. But it also includes more subtle forms of manipulation. And we use misinformation as an umbrella term to cover both. And the reason for that is that if you look at the estimates of, we're trying to quantify how much information people are exposed to on a daily basis, particularly misinformation, which is very difficult to do, and our models and estimates aren't quite there. But from what we can see, people aren't exposed to outrageous falsehoods in their usual people, right, everyday citizens, at a alarming rate, right? You don't wake up and see the Earth is flat, um, I mean, you do see some outrageous claims in the current political climate. I'm not contesting that, but the frequency of which isn't as shocking as you might expect. However, we do see a lot of misleading information. So information that's subtly manipulative and used as a grain of truth, but otherwise is meant to throw people off. And that is much more prevalent and a much bigger problem. And research actually shows that if you compare its impact on let's say, people's inclinations to get vaccinated, then the stuff that gets fact checked as obviously false, that's bad, has a negative impact. But the stuff that's more subtle, and happy to give you an example. The impact was 50 times that of fact check misinformation in terms of negatively affecting people's vaccination decisions. And so misleading information is often a bigger problem, especially when it comes from trusted sources. Sometimes mainstream sources can also by accident spread misinformation that can be much more impactful than some fringe website that nobody visits. So for that reason, we wanted to be fairly comprehensive. And to give you an example of this sort of manipulation, there was a headline that said, a healthy doctor died 2 weeks after getting COVID vaccine. So technically true, a healthy doctor did die 2 weeks after getting the vaccine, but of course one had nothing to do with another. So it's correlation causation fallacy, which is a common technique where you imply one thing caused the other, even though it was a simple correlation confusion. It's also, of course, clickbait. The context is also shady, right? The CDC investigates many things that we don't report on because it's their job to investigate every side effect, every issue. Most of it is not of concern, but of course, when it comes to a vaccine, all of a sudden there's a big headline. So the significant potential to lead people astray, even though technically not 100% false. And that's the type of stuff that really gets people, I think. And that's why we think the misleading component of misinformation is worth potentially spending a bit more time on than the stuff that gets debunked and fact checked as obviously false. Yeah.
Now, look, I have a lot of people who say that people are getting stupider over time, and I'm very skeptical of this. I mean,
Right.
is the increase in misinformation just a result of the increase of information in general? I mean, do we have an epidemic? Because typically an
Mm.
epidemic refers to something that is, an event rather than a constant, right? So do we actually have an epidemic of misinformation, or is it just a constant human problem?
Yeah, so you were asking about the historical context before as well, and so in Foolproof, I actually calculate how long it took a message to spread in the Roman Empire, in terms of horse and wagon, and you're spreading a falsehood from one person to another, and so obviously people have been concocting falsehoods since the dawn of time, so that's not new, but I do think technology and the way we interact with technology is new and presents unprecedented problems for amplification and exposure. I guess the question is persuasion. That's another question, but I think most of us agree that there are more conspiracy theories now than ever before. We're exposed to them more. The question you posit: are people getting stupider? Are people persuaded more? That's the trickier one to answer. But I do think the scale of it is so much bigger. And the term infodemic, refers to the onslaught of not only true but also false, misleading information. It's coming at so many more sources, right? So back in the olden days, you had one or two sources of information. Now you have dozens and dozens. It's TikTok, WhatsApp, Snapchat, your friends, family, cable TV, right? There's so much of it. People have difficulty assessing the veracity of different sources so fast. There's so much information coming at you. We rely on simplified rules of thumbs. When the brain's overloaded in processing information, we resort to biases to try to sort one thing from another. So there's a lot more potential for things to go wrong. And I do think that there's a lot more low quality information that people are being inundated with. And I think the post-truth dilemma is that it is also true that we're now capable of seeking out so much more accurate information than ever before, right? So Neil
It's so
deGrasse
much
Tyson.
easier to fact check, right?
It's so much easier to fact check, but not everyone's doing this. So there must be something else, right? Some motivation to actually avoid doing that, and that has to do with the structure of social networks and how we organize ourselves and our biases that are amplified by technology, and also just by human psychology, irrespective of technology. But I think it's the intersection that's really interesting. But yeah, I think Neil deGrasse Tyson once said that I don't think that more people believe in crazy conspiracies now. It's just that um, everyone has access to Google now, and so I think that kind of sums it up in a nice way. I think that the access to conspiracy theories has gained. A lot, people have gained tremendous access to finding, creating, concocting conspiracy theories, and we're exposed to it on a much more regular basis. But interestingly, the proportion of people who believe in conspiracy theories seems to remain relatively stable. And so I think that is quite interesting. I think exposure is bad for a number of reasons. If you're continuously exposed, even if you don't believe in the conspiracy, you might still be partaking in asymptomatic spread where you could share it without believing it.
Uh,
It slowly erodes trust in mainstream institutions, democracy. It kind of builds in a cumulative, more indirect way. But the proportion of hardcore people who are into this is relatively stable, though we don't have good historical data. But I think we do have some interesting. The only one that's been tracked for a long time is the JFK one, which has been tracked since the 60s. For others, we don't have much data going back more than a decade or so in terms of consistent polling. So it's hard to say. But I think most people see these sort of ebbs and flows. When things are going badly in society, economic inequality, we got pandemics, climate change. Sometimes there's wars, right? So when stuff's going bad, there's more supply and demand for conspiracy theories. When things are good, there's like a buffer, right? People don't need as much of that conspiratorial stuff, misinformation. People seem to do all right. So I think it kind of ebbs and flows in a way with kind of along the way of how well society is doing at any given point in time. So I wouldn't say it's kind of a linear increase, but I think it kind of peaks and then ebbs and flows, and it kind of shows that kind of pattern. But there are some hypotheses about whether whether our thinking is being displaced by machines. So if we look at how students are using ChatGPT, if we look at how people are using LLMs for coding, whereas before you would use your brain to solve a problem, now we ask machines to solve it for us. Some people say, oh, it's great because then we can focus on the bigger issues. But some people say it's actually making us dumber because we're not using the crucial faculties of our brains for solving problems. I think the research is still out on that question, but yeah, it is a hypothesis.
Well, I mean, are there individual differences with respect to vulnerability, and are they rooted in personality, or is it primarily one of education and exposure?
Mm,
I mean, it'd be interesting to see if
yeah.
there's any tracking of, say, performance on cognitive reflection tests or AOT over time, right? The Flynn effect is we've seen IQ kind of go higher over time. Do you think if we were to look at cognitive reflection test scores in the general public, I mean, would they trend in a particular direction? I mean, would we see like a distribution in the population that's kind of constant? I mean, I don't think we have data, but could you speculate on that?
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I think somebody should look at that. That is interesting. I mean, I feel like the cognitive reflection test is meant to kind of trick people. So I think that most most people will be tricked by some of these questions, regardless. AOT, it's interesting, whether people are getting more closed-minded, perhaps over time. I'm not sure. I think that. Yeah, the analogy with IQ is interesting. So we have developed this test, the misinformation susceptibility test, which because everyone's kind of pulling headlines from the internet, and there was no standardized psychometric instrument like we have with some other areas of psychology, like personality. So we created this test actually with GPT, because with news there's a risk people have seen it before, and which makes it a memory exercise and not a true test of a latent ability that differs between people, right? So we made sure that nobody had ever seen these headlines, and then we asked people, how manipulative, or is this true, false? And we've got about 500,000 people that have taken this test. It's used by YouGov. We don't have enough years to really look at meaningful changes over time, but it could give us an indication of whether susceptibility to misinformation actually increases over time on this test. I don't think we have enough years to do that, but if you look at some of the correlates, one of the major predictors of performance on this test is actively open-minded thinking, right? More so than cognitive reflection. It's the ability to, keep multiple hypotheses in your head, to, be okay with uncertainty, take the perspective of other people. So, ideology correlates with cognitive rigidity, right? The more ideological people are, the more rigid, the more closed off they are. So in some ways, the antidote to misinformation and conspiracy theories is being open-minded about things, not attaching yourself to a motivated sort of hypothesis, and that does strongly predict lower susceptibility to misinformation. Other things, we might expect, the more more time people spend on social media, the more susceptible they are to misinformation. Education, obviously, more educated people are less susceptible. Same with analytical thinking, cognitive reflection, and then some of the other interesting factors are things like trust, right? That people are very distrustful. They tend to be more susceptible. Okay, but I suppose they would say that they're more resilient because they don't trust anyone. But yeah, right. But and so there's some gender differences, some age differences, but they're not too big, I would say. And so it's quite interesting. Gen Z, actually, younger people are some of the most vulnerable compared to older generations. Although older generations share more misinformation, which is interesting. I think that has to do more with politics, whereas younger audiences tend to be more susceptible, but don't necessarily share more. So I think there's a lot of these interesting nuances that come up with misinformation susceptibility. But yeah, certainly that's an interesting area, especially in how people improve on this measure. And cross-cultural generalizability is difficult, right? Because news is different in different cultures and so on. But yeah, I think it's important to try to have standardized measurements, instruments to try to answer these type of questions. Particularly, is it going up or not?
Well, I mean, some people would argue that, at least among the crazier beliefs, that these are not really truly held beliefs, but really are kind of signals of affiliation, right? And that, a lot of the motivation for this is group identity. And so, I mean, we look at Pizzagate. I mean, there was only one person that tried to rescue,
Mm.
the children. And if you would think that if, millions of people actually believed this, then there would be more than one that would kind of go and try to do something about it.
Yeah, so Pizzagate is, I think, is interesting in that I think it's true what you're saying, and that for the most ridiculous stuff, it comes down to, and there's some interesting research in moral psychology on this, on the sort of gist perception, right? That people don't literally think that it's true, but the gist resonates with a particular worldview or identity. So, for example, when Trump says that immigrants are eating cats and dogs, people probably don't think that that's literally true. I mean, some people do and will go out and shoot somebody, maybe, but most people would probably think that that's an exaggeration. But it kind of resonates with that. Oh, immigrants do bad things, and that's why I don't like immigrants. It kind of like feeds into this sort of perception. Although a counter argument would be that obviously January 6th was not one person coming out. There were a lot of people, thousands of people storming the Capitol because they thought the election was stolen. That if Trump hadn't floated the conspiracy theory that the election was stolen, where else would people gotten that notion, right? Somebody needs to mobilize these folks and feed them conspiracy theories. And so I would say that it depends. Sometimes it's a lone actor. I mean, in the book, I talk about this guy who believes in the reptilian conspiracy theory and starts thinking his brother is a reptile and decapitates him with a sword. Most people are not doing this, right? That's a one sort of individual, probably unstable already. But I think for other events, it could be quite significant in terms of the damage that can be done if it seems plausible enough to people. So it's a whole pipeline, right? So let's take the opposite view. There were some fringe Democrats that were saying that Trump staged his own assassination, which was clearly nonsense. The sort of blue anon sort of stuff, right? But then you have elites basically policing this and saying, stop floating these nonsensical conspiracy theories. We need to promote truth and accuracy, and this is nonsense. We're not gonna amplify that. But let's say that there were elites who were amplifying this thing. Yeah, Trump staged it. We need to do something about this, right? And then it becomes normative and so on. And so I think misinformation can escalate regardless of its plausibility if it's being endorsed by elites, by leaders, when it becomes more socially normative. Even when in hindsight, when you interview, a lot of interviews of the people who participated in the riots were like, oh yeah, I was just like totally in the zone, and I was bought into this whole narrative. And so it can, but it's not very frequent, right? but it's also stochastic. So this concept called stochastic terrorism, which is the probability of violence increases as some nonlinear function of the information environment. The riots in the UK are another example of that. That some crazy story that there was something terrible happened, right? That some guy stabbed a bunch of little children at a dance club, but then a completely false story emerged that he was an asylum seeker who came by boat recently to the UK, and then people who were already upset about immigration took that story, right, and turned it into a motivation, free pass to go out and set buildings on fire, tear stuff down. National riots erupted, and so this fake news story was the accelerant, right? The kind of the evidence that they needed to enact their pre-existing intentions. And so that's kind of where it builds. I think fake news and misinformation can come in at a crucial juncture and then kind of light things on. That's why we have the flame on the front of the other book. It can sort of, light things on fire when it comes at the right time, at the right moment. And that's why I think it can be dangerous.
Well, look, I mean, social psychologists have been interested in this topic of right false belief and persuasion for as long as there's been social psychology. I mean, I think you started off
Yeah.
about the Ash experiments, which I think, if anybody knows anything about social psychology, like that's the one experiment that they know about. But do we know what the interior belief state is or was with those subjects in those experiments? I mean, to what extent were they
Mm.
sort of, just agreeing with the crowd because they wanted to go along? And to what extent did they actually believe what they claimed to believe, at least for the ones
Yes.
performing?
Sure, yeah. So the textbook coverage of that experiment is usually right that there was this Confederate who was giving the wrong answer, and then the other people in the group would sort of also give the wrong answer when asked which of the three lines fit the one that they were seeing. And I think people have questioned the motivations that people give during that experiment. So the initial explanation was informational influence, right? You hear somebody else say this, the right answer is B, so I don't know, so it's probably going to be B, even though it's obvious that the answer isn't B, right? And so it's big news because it seems people forego their perceptions to sort of go with the group. But people haven't really decided on. When you look at the interview data, some of the participants said, I just wanted to be liked by the group, right? I just want to go along with the group, which is conformity, which is a different process than informational influence. And some of them might have been uncertain, right? And for them, it was an informational cue. For others, it was more like, I want to do what everyone else does. I don't want to be the odd one out. So they were conforming. So people have questioned the original explanation. I think I have a note in the book where I go through some of that presentation also that there were plenty of people who didn't conform. When you look over trials, not everyone conforms to this, but it is well replicated. So people to this day can replicate that experiment. They do say that conformity levels are declining in the U.S. Over time, which is interesting. And so we've been actually thinking about adapting. One of my students, it's now faculty in Copenhagen, came up with this idea of whether we could adapt the Ash paradigm and see if you could inoculate people from social influence. So if you inoculate them beforehand that somebody's going to try to convince everyone to go along with their preferred option that they have to resist, and then redo the whole thing and see if that undermines the whole influence effect.
Well, let's get back to this idea of inoculation because you use the biology metaphor, right?
Mm,
Where when we're looking at the diffusion of a virus, right, the population starts off susceptible, and then they get infected, and
yeah.
they recover. Okay, and we can talk about the R naught. The idea here is that a virus is only a problem if it's infectious, right? So, what is the
Yes.
analogy here? I mean, are bad ideas or false statements or misinformation? I mean, are they more infectious than true statements and well reasoned arguments and so forth?
Yes, that's more or less that's part of it, I would say. Sometimes people are like mind viruses, and calling ideas viruses is a bit uncomfortable.
Elon
But from
Musk, most famously, right?
and Musk with the woke mind virus, and I actually think that what's interesting. I think he's way off base with the woke thing. I mean, I don't think he really understands it, and he's just i- the interpretation of woke, I think, is an issue. But I think he's not wrong that ideologies can go viral. And you know my thinking on this issue is not so much on the purely conceptual level, but it's just empirical. If you apply models from epidemiology to how information spreads, they fit really well. So people propagate information from one to another. Once somebody shares it with you, you share it with another person, and that's how viral models also propagate. Right? You get infected, then you talk to somebody else, or you come in contact with somebody, they get infected, and then it spreads. You can make them more complicated, less complicated. People complain like, oh, but behavior is not like a simple virus of simple exposure. That's true for some viruses as well. You gotta sneeze on somebody 10 times before they catch your cold. And so, maybe you need to interact with somebody 10 times before you adopt their idea. That's not a problem. We just make the epidemiological model a little bit more complex. If you look at the latest COVID models, they a big challenge is factoring in spatial clustering. And that's in terms of viral spread. Most of the viral models are pretty simple. They don't take into account spatial clustering, which is what humans tend to do.
They just
Uh,
assume your probability of encountering another person is constant across.
Constant, exactly. Yeah. That's a simplifying assumption, right? And so, but that's not true because people cluster. And so you can add a spatial, some of the things we're doing now is you can add a spatial layer to these models to include the idea of confirmation bias and echo chambers and so on. To me, it just makes the whole epidemiological metaphor more interesting, not less. But people sort of debate about the technicalities of some of these factors. But that was the driving factor for me, is that we can take viral propagation models, apply them to information, and that works pretty well across a whole range of scenarios. And so it's not about whether the viral analogy makes people feel comfortable or not. It's just what the models show. And then of course, there's the question of like inside the body, like what happens. And in the book, I do make some interesting comparisons that, viruses want to hijack their host cell. But coming back to infectiousness, because I realized I didn't actually answer your question. So yeah, so research shows that great paper in Science recently from Molly Crockett's lab that misinformation exploits moral outrage specifically, for example, that misinformation tends to be shocking, novel, emotionally manipulative, highly moralized, polarized, uses conspiracy cognition, paranoia, right? Whereas factual neutral news uses none of those things. It tends to be boring, neutral, no loaded words, right? And so that tends to not go viral. Most people don't engage with fact checks. That's why fact checks don't go viral. So in the cascades of when you model these things, there are clear differences in the virality of misinformation and the virality of neutral, objective information. And so, yeah, the infectiousness of these two things is very different. Now, of course, you can come up with some news that is hyper sensationalized and also kind of true, and then say it follows a similar path to misinformation. But that's because you're making it more like misinformation by throwing in lots of manipulation techniques in the framing and the polarization and right. And so that just makes me believe that a lot of our current news environment isn't maybe what it should be in terms of objective, neutral, unbiased reporting. And maybe I'm a dinosaur for thinking that should still be the case with news. But that's kind of how our thinking evolved. I'm also originally Dutch, right? And so we believe, a lot of the Nordic and Western European countries sort of believe in this media model of neutral reporting on events, and so that is that was our thinking. And the last thing I'll say about it is that a virus wants to replicate, right? It wants to replicate itself. So misinformation isn't a problem. if it can't spread, but it has to find a susceptible host. So for me, the viral analogy is that misinformation wouldn't spread unless it can find a susceptible host. So there's something about human psychology that makes it susceptible to being infected with misinformation, and then our desire to want to share it with others. And so that's kind of where it aligns for me.
Well, look, when we're trying to figure out why certain viruses become very infectious, I mean, there's two possibilities. I mean, one is that you have this, I don't know, you have a lot of people jammed into a very tight space, right? That makes
Yeah, yeah.
transmission easier. So that's where, the 1918 flu, I think, evolved in these, military encampments and so forth. Or it's like engineered in a lab, like perhaps, COVID
Yep.
19, right? So I
Right.
mean, I think there are similar analogies here, right? There are people that will specifically genetically engineer these ideas to be viral, but then there's others that just sort of, I mean, is there an analogy to this idea of, like, having these tight, dense networks that facilitate the emergence of very infectious pathogens?
Yeah, yeah, it's a great question. An interesting analogy. Yeah, I would say that the lab engineered one, and that's what I spend most of the book on, is talking to people who engineer what we would call disinformation, I suppose, right? Intentionally false information for a living, and what techniques that they use. And I took that inspiration from Bob Cialdini, who went around talking to salespeople to figure out what the rules of persuasion are. And so I figured, let's talk to manipulators to figure out what techniques they're using to manipulate others. But then there's this sort of echo chamber situation, and it's interesting because when you look at the network structure of an echo chamber, um, it becomes much more difficult for contrary information to get in, right? So fact checks, when they disperse on social media, when they um, um, diffuse, they often can't get into echo chambers because people are selectively interpreting and endorsing and selecting information. They don't want the fact checks that disconfirm their beliefs. So the fact checks actually don't make it inside the echo chamber, right? And so people are selectively exposed to their own ideas. So I would say that within the echo chamber, um, simulation kind of work shows that misinformation can go viral within an echo chamber when it confirms people's sort of pre-existing beliefs, right? But if you wanted for a message to go viral in general, then a clustered environment is not so good because you need long ties outside of your echo chamber to broadcast a message very broadly, right? So if you wanted to reach the most amount of people, you actually need lots of people, outside of your echo chamber in order to propagate the message. So I think both can be true. Stuff can, rumors go viral um, because you come up with something crazy on social media, and then some influencer who's not in your network picks it up, and then millions of people see it. Then some other influence. That's how things can go viral, right? But they can also go viral within an echo chamber and kind of radicalize people in a much more restricted kind of way that people will just pile on, and it goes viral within the echo chamber, and then it leads to more extremism and polarization.
Well, maybe we could get into the difference between debunking and pre-bunking. And it seems like the conventional way of countering false beliefs or misinformation is to just kind of reiterate the truth, right? Or try to,
Yes.
try to argue or persuade by pointing to evidence and data and so forth. And I think for many of us who have been in the business of trying to do that, we've realized it's kind of difficult. So,
Sure.
um,
Yeah.
and so, why is it that we continue to believe that, like, debunking is the most effective way? I mean, why didn't we think about? I mean, I guess there have been people that have thought about pre-bunking. I know a lot of philosophical texts come with objection and reply portions
Right.
at the end of the book. And some people would argue, why would you want to expose your readers to all of these wonderful arguments against your position?
Right. Um, in fact, I think well, there's Bill McGuire, of course, a social psychologist who in the late '60s, early '70s started testing this. But I found some text from Aristotle and Socrates to some extent, where they talk about preempting dodgy arguments, which I think is the core of it, right? Um, but the reason I think why we think that debunking is effective is because it seems like the natural thing to do, right? So you hear something and then you need to counter it. It's much harder to think about preemption, right? That before something has happened, we tend to react to things. That's how companies operate, governments. Something bad happens and now we need to react. But it's much harder for people. I mean, we have a prefrontal cortex, so we engage in planning, so it is possible, right? But it is very tricky for people to think in advance about, I need to preemptively prepare people for an impending attack that may or may not come, right? So that they're going to be inoculated once it happens. But I think there are good reasons for doing so. I mean, Zelensky was pre-bunked this deepfake from Putin that was going to show Zelensky surrendering, and he sort of pre-bunked it nationally, and but then the deepfake from Putin never came, um, um, until it did, and then he was happy that he still invested in this pre-bunking campaign because it just didn't happen when he thought it would happen, but it did happen in the end. And the thing is, you can't always predict when there's going to be a misinformation attack, but a lot of the techniques are repeated. And historically documented, and some of them you can predict that some of them will reoccur in slightly different variations. I know I talk often about the anti-vax, the vaccine's going to change your DNA stuff, right? That if you take the COVID vaccine, it's going to change your DNA. It seems new because it's a new vaccine, and RNA technology. Sorry, something in my throat. The sort of yeah, the sort of newer not weakened dose live viruses are different, and people worry about them, and that's normal. But if you go back to the 1800s, to the first vaccine, you actually see these sort of historical propaganda campaigns about how if you took the cowpox vaccine, which was the first vaccine against smallpox, right, from Edward Jenner, you were going to turn into a human cow hybrid, and which implies that the cowpox vaccine is changing your DNA, and you're going to turn into a human cow hybrid. So same technique 200 years later, and that you can preempt and predict, and if you do the weakened dose correctly, I think there's very little harm other than building sort of broad scale resilience. I do think there's another case I describe in the book where pre-bunk seems a little more precarious. For example, the Wayfair scandal, where they were part of a pedophile, satanic, pedophile ring, and they were smuggling little girls in their cabinets, supposedly, because the prices of the cabinets were out of control. And if you search the product number in a Russian search engine, pictures of missing girls would come up. So what do? You go out and you tell your customers that you may hear that we're going to be part of a satanic pedophile ring, right? That seems a bit trickier. But you can empower people to think about the building blocks of conspiracy theories in general without having to talk about, satanic pedophile rings. And I think that's the power of inoculation and pre-bunking, that you have total flexibility, what the weakened dose is, how weak it is, how neutralized, of a dose you're going to use. Some of our work with technology companies, they didn't want to talk about climate change, immigration. They want a completely risk-free neutral doses. So we talk about scapegoating. We use which is unfairly blaming minority groups in society for all kinds of unrelated problems, right? So we take a clip from South Park, where they blame everything on Canada, which is funny for both liberals and conservatives, right? So everyone can understand what scapegoating means in that context. But then we give people examples from social media that have the exact same structure, but are a little more, heated. But then people can say, "Oh yeah, scapegoating. That's manipulative." And so that's kind of, I think, why inoculation is useful.
Well, I mean, it seems like extremist groups have been using pre-bunking for a long time, right? So if you're in a cult, or if you are in some extremist ideology, they're going to tell you, listen, your neighbors are going to tell you this, and your family's going to tell you this, but hey, you are in possession of the truth, and these people are trying to, tempt you away from the righteous path. I mean, Haven't those folks been aware of pre-bunking and used it to shore up sort of crazy things, right? And false
Yeah, yeah.
beliefs?
Absolutely. I think inoculation, at the end of the day, it's a neutral rhetorical tool, right? Anyone can use it for any purpose. But if you look at what the intention was from the ancient Greeks, they talked about snake oil salesmen manipulation. They wanted to use it in the interest of the public and build broad scale sort of resistance. Maguire was interested in who was a social psychologist who came up with the viral analogy, but who he was interested in deceptive advertising, right, and helping people with that. And he has a joke in one of his articles where he gets a call from an advertising exec, and he says, "Oh, I don't think you're going to be interested in my work. I'm trying to help people inoculate themselves against advertising." And he says, "Oh no." Oh no! Don't underestimate yourself. This could be very useful for our competitors, and I think that that really embodies that it's just a tool. Anyone can use it. And you're quite right that the only group of people that I know of that have used this extensively are extremist cults, and they will use it to shore up defenses against friends, family, the mainstream. They will say if somebody rejects. Uh, our religion, then you have to label them a suppressive person, or whatever the terminology. I think that's a Scientology term, but different variations have different techniques on what they say, but the gist is always the same. Don't trust they're going to tell you this, right? They're going to get science, evolution. They're going to talk to you about these things. However, you should know these are our facts, and so on. And then somebody could say, "Oh, but isn't inoculation just brainwashing from the other side?" But not really. And so what we need to do is focus on the techniques of manipulation that are universally deemed inappropriate, whether that's a false dilemma, scapegoating, emotional manipulation, ad hominem attacks, faking expertise, things that are just bad, regardless of what side you're on. And then do that in schools from a very early age on, so that bad actors don't have an opportunity to inoculate in use it for bad purposes that are not in the public interest. So I think the only solution to the problem that somebody could use it for evil purposes is that you have to get there earlier and faster. And so that's why we need to roll this out in every major educational program from a very early age, in a non-political way, so that citizens are empowered to spot manipulation techniques and then make up their own mind about what they want to believe, but at least free from manipulation, so that when some cult tries to radicalize them, they're going to be resistant to that and see through. And in fact, we have an inoculation against the playbook of cults, which is find a vulnerable target, gain their trust, isolate them from their friends and family, and then get them to do something on behalf of the cause. It's a very predictable strategy that you can inoculate people against. And again, it's irrespective of content, veracity. These are just the techniques. And I think the technique level, right? That's the most kind of non-political, neutral way that you can do this. And you look at countries like Finland. I mean, they've been doing this with kids, shoring up their defenses against foreign propaganda. They score some of the highest on media literacy, numeracy, scientific literacy, propaganda education, free speech, freedom of the press. They're doing well. They're resilient because they've thought about it. They've armed themselves, and they're able to fight this stuff off.
Well, look, there's some people that have argued that exposing people to bad ideas is risky, and it may, um, you know, it's like, they may get the flu from the flu virus, right? And other people
Right.
have argued that if you expose people to opposing ideas, then all it does is kind of retrench their existing beliefs. And so, how do you avoid those dangers? I mean, one of the things I liked about your interventions is that for many of them, you're actually asking the participants to put themselves in the shoes of the manipulator. So as opposed to just simply exposing them to the manipulations, you have them actually engage in the manipulations, right, to see it from the other side. Is that the most effective way?
Yeah, there's different ways of doing it, and I think the point. That's always the response I give, right? But because it follows the vaccine analogy, you don't actually get the flu vaccine. You don't actually get the flu from the flu vaccine. So it has to be a weakened dose. That's the risk mitigation strategy, right? That if you do the weakened dose wrong, then there's a risk, and so you need to spend a lot of time thinking about this weakened dose. So with the social media companies, the way we weaken it was using clips from popular culture. You can't go wrong with that, right? So false dilemma, we use Star Wars, Obi-Wan talking to Anakin Skywalker, who goes on, spoiler alert, to become Darth Vader. I'm not going to do the whole, but he says, either you're with me or you're my enemy, right? Only a Sith deals in absolutes. That's the false dilemma. That's the structure. And then you go on to, if you don't support semi-automatic rifles, then you're against the Second Amendment. Boom, false dilemma, right? And so you take the structure of it that has zero risk, and then you inoculate people again. Cowpox, right? Cowpox vaccine, the one that I gave earlier. So that's how we do the risk kind of free one. But sometimes you have to do a weakened dose of the actual misinformation, and then it's important to be careful. For example, all of our stuff in the game is fictional. It's an exaggeration. It's sarcastic. Nobody actually believes it. So we exaggerate to the point of ridiculousness to minimize that people actually think that it's misinformation, right? Nobody's actually duped. Like if people actually think that what we're saying is true, then there wouldn't be a weakened dose. It would be, in the metaphor, it's too strong and it actually overwhelms people's immune system rather than triggers the production of the antibodies, right? And so that's the fine line that you need to sort of draw. And then, as you said, in the game, we came up with this perspective taking exercise that we're letting people so it's not necessarily the case that there's all these people. Sometimes you get these kind of like straw man versions of it, that all these people waiting for their mind vaccine and some Uber inoculator comes and injects you. I mean, that's not the way it is. Some people activate their own resistance through a simulated experience of what it's like to be manipulated, and people start thinking, oh, this isn't good. What would that person do? What would I do? And like, how would I resist this, right? And so there's agency. It's a conversation people are having internally through the game. And people have asked all the time, like, oh, but what if people think that what's in the game is true? Or, we kind of follow what people do afterwards. Sometimes we scrape the comments, discussions, and most of the time people are really good at translating it. So there's this thread that I found particularly illuminating, where they were like, "Oh, it's like a game where you're training in the character of your opponent to learn their tricks." And so people are sort of translating this for the most part, I think, in the correct way. But yeah, we do think a lot about the weekend dose. Sometimes you might think, if something isn't going to go viral, um, you don't want to use a literal weakened dose where you think that people might misinterpret it. I think that is one of the most practical risks that I've dealt with. So I do this a lot with organizations, and I tell them, no, that this is not weakened enough. I mean, people might actually believe that this is true. So you have to do something else. You have to, weaken it further. So to give you an example, in the vaccine space, there's this issue with, oh, some childhood vaccines don't have a pure control group, so we don't have baseline safety data, right? But the whole point is that we used to have control groups with childhood vaccines until the 70s, and then people thought it wasn't ethical anymore to not give the control group kids the vaccine, right? So we already know that they work. We just have different types of control groups now. So it's like, how would you explain that without somebody misunderstanding or like giving them the idea that childhood vaccines don't have a control group? So we had this video where this doctor was out near a plane, wind blowing in his face, and it's like, we're going to test this new parachute, and it's like super safe, German manufacturer, it's going to be super safe. And then this poor chap, this other doctor over here, is going to get a placebo parachute. And then like, let's see if that tells us something about whether parachutes work. And then immediately people understand, like, oh yeah, it's obvious that we don't need to do that experiment. And so that's weakened, right? But you could do that actually in a way that could lead to a misconception. So yeah, I've been quite involved in writing handbooks, and McGuire was also pretty strong on this weakened dose. Like, you don't want to do that wrong. And so hopefully we've put enough practical guidance out there so that people can get that part right.
Well, look, I mean, how is this different from old school critical thinking? I mean, I used to teach critical thinking for years, and it's a topic that for some reason is not in all the schools. Right? It's not in
Yeah.
the MBA level. It's not in undergrad level. It's not even in the high school level. I mean, couldn't we just think about incorporating, say, critical thinking, understanding all the different fallacies and correlation isn't causation, anecdote isn't data, all that kind of stuff. I mean, is formal in training of that sort, could that maybe help immunize people going forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's useful. I think critical thinking is useful. As you rightly say, there isn't enough of it in schools. It's kind of shocking how basic critical thinking isn't taught. Um, some philosophers have concerns that if you teach people about logical fallacies, people will see them everywhere. But it's true. People use them in daily life. I have to correct myself sometimes, where I'm like, oh no, that's a false dilemma. Never mind that. Right? And so I think it's only a good thing to make people aware of those. But I think there's two differences. One is yeah, there's a bit of overlap when you're talking about logical fallacies, for example, but it's the delivery mechanism is different, right? So it's the forewarning plus the weakened dose presentation that is specific to inoculation, rather than just giving people an factual overview of what logical fallacies are. It's also about the sort of the interactive element, right? Let people generate their own understanding and resistance, learning from experience rather than from analytical thinking. So there's a few differences there, but I think the biggest difference is in the level of specificity. So inoculation as an approach is predicated on the idea that people don't have the right mental defenses in the moment, and
Mm.
people won't recruit the sort of general thinking skills fast enough in the moment to resist a particular attack. So inoculation is all about weakened exposure to the type of misinformation you might see in the future, right? And it's building either broader skill or specific resistance. But what I always find is that people don't have the right tools to resist specific types of attacks. Um, and inoculating people beforehand through a simulation of what they might experience online and how they might be manipulated, it's that level of specificity. Talk about schools, conspiracy theories. They all have the same building blocks. Tupac Shakur is still alive on an island. Avril Lavigne's a clone. NASA didn't, fake the moon landing. And so, a lot of them use the same sort of narrative. You know, how plausible is it that all of these theories are recycled, right? And so you can actually derive the building blocks. But most teachers don't know about conspiracy theories. Most students, um, are not taught in a very specific way. Now, maybe build their own conspiracy theory, see what it's like. Learn the trick from the inside out so that you won't be duped by it. So I think it's that level of specificity, and I'm not saying that inoculation or pre-bunking is the only way to teach people. It's just a very specific format that is evidence-based. I'm sure there's other evidence-based ways to do it, and the more the merrier, I would say at this point. But that is kind of the difference, I think, that we don't want to, this general media literacy stuff or check your sources and open up a different tab. All important skills, but it's not inoculating people against specific attacks that might be happening online. In a conference full of scientists, I once asked if somebody could explain to me the physics of why the Earth isn't flat. And then I realized that only one person raised their hand. Most people don't have we know it's not true, but we don't have the mental defenses in place to deconstruct why it's not true and how to protect others from falling for the same trick. And so that's the type of
Yeah.
resistance that we're hoping to build with inoculation.
So while critical thinking might strengthen your immune system in general, like exercise and sunshine and so
Yeah,
forth, you might need specific inoculations against specific diseases, and you might need booster shots from time to time. Excellent.
absolutely.
Yeah. Well, Sandra, thank you so much for joining me. The book is called Foolproof. Check it out. But also this one, fantastic book, Psychology of Misinformation. We'll talk again soon.
Thanks so much for having me.